Hi, I'm Lauren. My dad was Tony Nicklinson, and to a lot of people, he was the poster boy for assisted dying. Dad would be so knocked off if he knew I had this platform right now and he didn't. He loved a captive audience and he would have really relished the chance to speak to you all direct, but it's not to be. Thankfully, like my dad, I love the sound of my own voice, so I do hope that I can do him justice tonight. Yesterday marked 10 years since our Supreme Court ruling, but to be honest, I had no idea. The legal stuff goes completely over my head, but understanding the legalities isn't the role that Mum, my sister Beth and I needed to fulfill. Our role is to make the public fall in love with my dad. And to be honest, even 12 years after his death, it's still really easy. Sorry. Dad was tall, dark and handsome, something that definitely helped us get the front pages of many of the newspapers in this country. He was the life and soul of every situation. He loved his life, his family and his friends. He never shied away from a challenge, a trait that was of good use for him in the years to come, and he loved nothing more than a pint whilst watching the rugby with his friends. His wants and needs were simple. He never asked for much, despite giving everything to anyone who ever asked. Growing up with Dad was fun, although Beth and I wouldn't dare cross him. Of course, we loved winding him up, but we definitely knew where to stop. I'm sure our childhood with Dad was like many others. He taught us how to ride bikes and dive into swimming pools. He helped us with our homework, but he had a gentle side that didn't always align with his public alpha ego that he seemed to have. I was a daddy's girl and generally managed to get what I wanted. I was always so proud to tell people that Tony Nicklinson was my dad. To anyone looking in, he was a regular dad, but he was my dad, he was my special dad, and I loved him more than any of you listening right now. It was June 2005 when everything went sour. We were living in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates and life was good. I was doing my A-level exams and Beth was doing her GCSEs, and the four of us were happy. Dad was on a business trip to Athens and Mum received a call from one of his colleagues to say he was in intensive care following a stroke. Mum needed to get to Greece quick as it wasn't looking good. A blood clot in his heart had flicked off and made itself comfortable in his brainstem, leaving him with locked-in syndrome. He was paralysed from the neck down and unable to speak. He was buried in his own body. Can you comprehend that? Some people find this really hard to get their heads around, like it couldn't possibly have been that bad, because what world would torture someone so savagely? But he literally could not move. Consider now, as you sit here, what it feels like to not be able to move a single muscle apart from your eyelids. It blows my mind sometimes when I remember what the last 7 years of his life were like. Tragic doesn't even come close. I joined Mum in Athens 10 days later, and I will never forget walking into that intensive care unit. I took one look at Dad, ran out, and started to hyperventilate against a wall. He was yellow, swollen, and punctuated with tubes. We didn't know how compos mentis he was or how much he could feel. But all became clear quickly, as the moment he saw me, he started to cry. I pulled myself together, I walked back in, and I said goodbye. I told him I loved him, and I promised him I would work hard to develop an alcohol tolerance that would make him proud. I nailed that within about the first 3 weeks of university, and my husband can confirm that's still very much the case. I understood quickly what his future held and guessed what was to come, his desire to die, and there were points when I silently promised him that when his time came, so would mine. At 17 years of age, I didn't know how I would survive without him, and every day for 7 years, I told him I loved him because I never knew when his last day would be. 2 months later, we finally got the okay to travel back to the UK. I had been in Athens with Mum and Dad for 6 weeks, and I went via Sharjah to collect my sister and explain what was going on. Mum decided that because Beth was at home whilst we were in Athens, she wasn't going to tell her how dire the situation was. So when I got back home, together with Mum on the phone, we told her. We also told Beth that 3 days later, we were moving back to the UK for good. I had been planning on returning to the UK that summer anyway to go to university. But Beth, she had her immediate future, her home, her friends, the dogs, and now her dad all ripped out from under her feet and just hours to accept it. I was 18 by then and had done a lot of growing up in the 6 weeks I was in Athens. But Beth, who was just 16, had it all to come, and I will never forgive the universe for that. But we pushed on and life continued. Mum was grieving for her husband and trying to figure out what on earth she was going to do. Dad lived for a few years in hospitals and specialist care homes whilst Mum bought a property and had the garage converted into a suitable living space for him. For the 5 years Dad was at home, every day was the same. He would wake up, he'd be washed by a carer, he'd be put in his wheelchair, he'd be fed something mushy, spend time on his computer, he could type with his eye blinks. He'd be fed something else mushy, be moved to his armchair, he'd watch TV, be fed something else mushy, be moved to his bed, he'd watch some more TV, have a little bit of sleep, and that would be his day on repeat. All of this was punctuated by either mum or a carer, a stranger, attending to his toilet needs, wiping the dribble from his mouth, scratching his itches, brushing his teeth, dressing him, shaving him, stretching his limbs when his muscles seized. Dad endured about 2,555 days, over 61,000 hours of this. Tell me someone who could do that. The physical limitations that Dad now faced meant that his personality changed. How could it not? Everything he enjoyed he could no longer do. He would wail hysterically, and it was agony to listen to. He completely withdrew from us. He was grieving for himself and the life he had lost right up until the very end. So 6 months after arriving in the UK, he told us that this life wasn't for him. He told us he wished he hadn't called the ambulance and was left to die in that hotel room in Athens. Knowing the suffering he was enduring, I too wished he had died in Athens. But we asked him to give it a bit longer, and he did. But 6 months later, he told us the same thing, and we agreed to do all that we could within the boundaries of the law to help him die. Mum tracked down Seema Shahal and Paul, Bo and Casey, two amazing legal minds. They spearheaded our legal challenge, which centred on Dad's desire to die at home at a time of his choosing with the help of a doctor. What makes life worth living is subjective, and the individual should be able to make that choice for themselves. Why should he have to live? Why should he have to go to Switzerland? Why should Mum face a murder conviction of 14 years in prison if she was to help him? We faced much criticism, some of it nasty and personal. We had letters from religious organisations telling us we were going to burn in hell. We had national newspaper columnists write lengthy articles telling Dad to stop moaning and to starve himself to death already, accusing Mum of being fame-hungry. We were accused of reintroducing Nazi death camps and the mass execution of the disabled, and there was a Facebook page mocking Dad, telling him to get a job. Thankfully, this was few and far between, but it was still upsetting, even if we all knew hell didn't exist. We have always accepted that not everyone in a similar situation to Dad would want to exercise this right. Some people are happy living with disabilities. Some people believe that it is for their God to end their life, and some people just want to see it to the natural end. But Dad did not believe any of those arguments, and neither do we. We still don't. We believed and still do that Dad, as someone of sound mind, should have been able to make this choice for himself. As an able-bodied person, I can end my life, but Dad could not, and he was experiencing immense suffering as a result. It's discrimination. The campaign took the assisted dying debate to an unprecedented place. Dad was not terminal. He was disabled and was experiencing incurable suffering, but he was not dying. We campaigned for years, and in August 2012, the High Court said no. It was one for Parliament. What little life Dad had left was snuffed out, and he had been handed a death sentence. I absolutely see the irony here. This is what we had all wanted, but his death was not the comfortable, pain-free one that he deserved. The ruling came through on a Thursday, and the following Monday, Beth called me at work and told me to come home. Dad was on his way out. The doctor had visited and said he had a collapsed lung. If he sought treatment, he might live. Dad politely declined. He also refused all food and hydration. What was the point in sustaining a life he did not want to live? When I look back at the TV footage from that day of the High Court ruling, I can see he was ill then. His breathing was laboured, and knowing now that his lungs were completely buggered, he must have been in so much pain, but he powered through. My theory is that he didn't say anything on the basis that if we lost, he had a way out, but if we won, he could have sought treatment, and he could have exercised his rights. What so many people forget is that to give people the choice to die often gives them the desire to live. Dad rapidly went downhill and quickly became unconscious. He had pneumonia and was effectively suffocating. He was drowning in his own phlegm. On the Tuesday night, Mum, Beth and I took it in turns to keep a vigil by his bed, as we were terrified he would die, and no one would be there to hold his hand. As it happened, it was the next morning when Mum was in the shower that Dad thought, now's the time. He was always going to go in the most awkward and inappropriate way possible. Beth was with him. He opened his eyes. She called for us. We ran into his room. Mum in a dressing gown with shampoo in her hair. Never forget that image. He took one last breath and he stopped breathing. I remember staring at him and thinking that TV dramas do get it right, because people do really die with their eyes open. I also remembered feeling like a large block of concrete had been lifted from my shoulders. Dad's suffering had weighed me down for so long. Now, don't misinterpret this as me saying that he was a burden. He was the furthest thing from it. I loved Dad regardless of his ability to walk and talk. But seeing someone you love so much hurt every day and being powerless to do anything about it, it takes its toll. And that was it, really. Mum called the legal team, the doctor and the undertaker, and washed the shampoo from her hair. The team at Binman's dealt with the media, and there was one hell of a flurry, arranging a press conference in about 90 minutes. We did ask for privacy, but unfortunately it wasn't granted. Within an hour of the news breaking, we had press photographers with long lenses outside the house. The next day on page 5 of The Sun was a picture of Dad's body being removed from the house. Consequently, they never got another single interview from us ever again. So, the truth is, my dad was no more special than any of yours, but he did do an extraordinary thing. He fought back, and together with our incredible legal team, he stood up and said that forcing him to live a life he did not want, one full of pain and suffering, was not okay. Now that Dad is gone, it's not about him anymore. In the years since Dad's death, Beth and I have met partners. Mum and Dad have 4 grandchildren. I have Harrison and Oliver, who are 5 and 2.5, and so much like their granddad with the love of engines, Harrison, and Bea, Oliver. He's a bit feral, like his granddad. Beth has Mila, who's almost 3, and Izzy, who is just 7 weeks old, hence why she's not here. Mila certainly has her granddad's presence, you know, when she walks into a room. The grief is always there. Some days it is lighter than others. When I dream of Dad, he never speaks because I can't remember his voice anymore. I can go for weeks without thinking of him. And then Oliver will chuck a rugby ball at my face and I will cry, mainly because it hurts like hell when a rugby ball cracks you on the nose, but also because he should be throwing that ball at his granddad Tony, not me. And then the wave comes over me again, and I fight for breath and spend days swimming back to the surface. He would have been a really great granddad. So now, this isn't about Dad anymore. It's about my sons and my nieces. I want them to grow up in a world where they have choice and autonomy. I want them to grow up in a world where their values and thoughts and choices are respected, where they do not need to follow in their granddad Tony's tragic footsteps if they choose not to. I appreciate that some people value life for what it is, but please do not deny anyone else the freedom of choice because it conflicts with your own moral or religious values. Because ultimately, this is all about autonomy and individual choice. What is right for you isn't necessarily right for me, and vice versa. Dad wanted to bring about his death, not anyone else's. And if my brain is battered by a blood clot one day and history is repeated, I'm confident I would want a way out, but I'm certain I'd want that choice at the very least. So please never forget my dad's suffering. Never forget my children and the future that I fear for them. Please keep talking about assisted dying, not just the terminally ill, but those with incurable suffering too. Thank you.